The HOA president called the cops on me for trespassing in my own backyard. Big mistake. She had no idea I'm the municipal judge who could shut down her entire corrupt operation with one signature. There I was, 9:17 on a Saturday morning, sweat dripping down my back as I wrestled with a fence post in the Texas heat. The metallic clang of my post hole digger echoed through the neighborhood when suddenly, whoop whoop, police sirens shattered the morning calm. 3 squad cars screamed into my driveway, gravel crunching under their tires like broken glass. I straightened up, dirt caked under my fingernails, and watched 3 officers step out with that familiar hand-on-belt stance. Behind them, HOA President Cordelia Blackthorne stood smugly by her white Lexus, arms crossed, practically vibrating with satisfaction. What she didn't know? For 6 months, I'd been building a federal fraud case against her, and her little power trip just became Exhibit A. What would you do if someone weaponized the police against you in your own yard? And where are you watching from? Drop your state below. I'll tell you if your HOA laws are as broken as ours were. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this mess. My name's Harrison Webb, and I've been a municipal judge for 20 years. After my divorce finalized last spring, I needed a fresh start. Somewhere quiet to rebuild my life and maybe rediscover that woodworking hobby I'd abandoned during my marriage. Maplewood Estates seemed perfect. A peaceful suburb of 147 homes outside Riverside County, where the morning air carried the sweet scent of jasmine and the sound of kids actually playing outside. The house I bought had this gorgeous corner lot with a massive backyard, perfect for the workshop I'd been dreaming about. At $185 a month in HOA dues, I figured I was buying into a well-managed community. That illusion lasted exactly 3 weeks. Enter Cordelia Blackthorne, 49 years old and HOA president for 8 years running. Picture a predator disguised as a suburban housewife, sharp-angled bob haircut that could slice through steel, always dressed like she was closing a hostile corporate takeover. Her white Lexus SUV gleamed like a weapon, and she had this unnerving habit of appearing whenever you least expected it, like a well-dressed vulture circling fresh roadkill. Cordelia wielded words like sweetie and hun, the way assassins use poison, sweet on the surface, deadly underneath. Her excessive floral perfume announced her presence from 3 houses away, mixing sickeningly with the smell of fear that seemed to follow her around the neighborhood. My introduction to Cordelia's reign of terror began with vandalism. Some kid with a baseball bat had turned my mailbox into abstract art, so I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. Bought an identical replacement and installed it. Same design, same height, same everything. The hardware store receipt was still warm in my wallet when I heard it, the distinctive thud of certified mail hitting my front porch like a legal grenade. The thick manila envelope crackled ominously as I tore it open. Inside was a violation notice that would have been laughable if it weren't so audacious. Unapproved exterior modifications, with a $150 fine escalating $50 daily until I attended a compliance hearing. Here's where my judicial training kicked in. This document had more holes than Swiss cheese. I pulled out the HOA's CC&Rs and searched every page for mailbox replacement procedures. Nothing. Zero. Nada. A walk around the neighborhood revealed the smoking gun. Dozens of identical mailboxes, many clearly newer than mine, with 0 violation notices. I started photographing everything, building a case file that would make any prosecutor proud. That's when Marcus from house number 47 wandered over, cold beer sweating in the afternoon heat. "Let me guess," he said with a bitter laugh. "Cordelia's marked you for destruction?" Marcus was an electrician who understood both circuitry and neighborhood politics. His horror stories about solar panel harassment, despite having every permit imaginable, painted a clear picture. Then there was Mrs. Chen at number 23, fined for excessive garden decorations, because she dared display 3 ceramic gnomes in her own flower bed. The pattern crystallized like ice forming on glass. Cordelia systematically targeted newer residents, professionals, anyone who threatened her iron grip on power. My 20 years of judicial experience screamed one thing: follow the money. As a homeowner, I had legal rights to HOA financial records. I submitted a formal written request, properly documented and certified. Cordelia's response? Delays, excuses, and bureaucratic stonewalling that would make a DMV clerk proud. Our first confrontation took place in the HOA office. a converted bedroom reeking of cheap pine-scented air freshener trying to mask something rotten underneath. Cordelia sat behind an oversized particle board desk with peeling laminate edges, the kind of bargain basement power display that screamed desperation. She made me wait 23 minutes. I timed it. Instead of getting frustrated, I photographed the posted budget numbers and documented the community center's shabby condition. For a place collecting nearly $400,000 annually, it looked like a hurricane had redecorated it. When Her Majesty finally granted me an audience, her greeting dripped with condescension. "Judge Webb, is it? Well, here in Maplewood, we follow community standards, not courtroom rules, sweetie." The click of my pen taking notes seemed to set her teeth on edge more than any verbal response could have. That night, evidence photos spread across my kitchen table like a crime scene investigation. I realized this wasn't about mailboxes or community standards. This was about power, control, and almost certainly money. Lots of it. Cordelia Blackthorne had just picked a fight with the wrong judge. Time to show her how real justice works. 2 weeks later, I decided to install a privacy fence along my backyard perimeter. Nothing fancy, just a standard 6-foot cedar fence to create some workshop space where I could run power tools without bothering the neighbors. I filed the proper HOA application, paid the ridiculous $75 review fee, and settled in to wait for approval. 30 days came and went, then 40. Then 47 days of complete radio silence while my application sat in what Cordelia called careful review. Back in law school, I'd learned that bureaucratic delays are often the first weapon of petty tyrants, starve people of basic services until they give up or make mistakes. Saturday morning, I'd had enough waiting. I hired a professional surveyor who spent Friday afternoon marking my exact property boundaries with bright orange flags. The metallic ping of his GPS equipment echoed across the neighborhood as he worked, each measurement triple-checked and documented. My divorce lawyer had taught me something valuable. When dealing with hostile opponents, over-documentation isn't paranoia, it's survival. 7 a.m. Saturday, I started digging. The rhythmic chunk of my post-hole digger cut through the morning silence, mixing with the distant hum of Marcus's coffee grinder and the sweet aroma of cedar planks warming in the early sun. 3 neighbors wandered over to watch, Marcus with his steaming mug, Mrs. Chen with encouraging nods, and Earl from number 156 who offered to help carry lumber. That's when the white Lexus prowled around the corner like a predator that had been lying in wait. 9:17 a.m. I'll never forget the timestamp because I was checking my watch when Cordelia emerged from her SUV armed with a measuring tape and an expression that could freeze hell. She'd clearly been watching from her living room window, probably timing her attack for maximum disruption. "Stop right there," she commanded, her heels punching holes in my soft lawn as she marched across it. "This fence extends onto HOA common area." I straightened up, wiping sawdust from my hands, and calmly produced the surveyor's report. "Actually, Cordelia, every post is 6 inches inside my property line. GPS-verified coordinates are right here." Her manicured fingers snatched the documents, scanning them with the desperation of someone hoping reality would bend to her will. When that failed, she pulled out her own measuring tape, a cheap plastic thing from the dollar store that looked like it couldn't measure a coffee table accurately. "I don't care what your papers say," she snapped, her voice rising to a pitch that sent nearby birds fleeing. "The HOA has easement rights, and you're in violation of community aesthetics." Here's where my judicial training kicked in with a lesson every judge learns early. Let your opponents destroy themselves with their own words. Instead of arguing, I quietly pulled out my phone and started recording. "Ma'am, I have a valid survey, municipal permits, and I'm working within all regulations," I said calmly, keeping my voice level and professional. That's when Cordelia made the mistake that would haunt her for months. She walked 30 feet away, still trespassing on my property, and made a phone call loud enough for the entire zip code to hear. "Yes, I need police immediately," she barked, pacing like a caged wolf. "There's a man trespassing on HOA property, destroying community assets, and he refuses to leave when ordered." The irony was so thick you could cut it with my circular saw. She was calling the police about trespassing while literally trespassing on my lawn. Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. Mrs. Chen's mouth fell open. Earl muttered something about enemy tactics under his breath. I kept working, the steady rhythm of hammer on nail providing a soundtrack to Cordelia's public meltdown. Every swing was measured and deliberate, because 20 years on the bench had taught me that composure under fire is the ultimate power move. 12 minutes later, gravel crunched under heavy tires as 2 squad cars rolled up. 3 officers stepped out, led by Sergeant Rodriguez, whose intelligent eyes had assessed hundreds of domestic disputes in my courtroom over the years. "Your Honor," Sergeant Rodriguez said, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. "Didn't expect to see you here." The color drained from Cordelia's face like someone had yanked the plug on her confidence. Her mouth opened and closed silently, a perfect impression of a fish gasping for air. But here's the twist that made my entire week. Instead of backing down, Cordelia doubled down on stupid. "I don't care if he's the Pope," she shrieked, completely losing whatever composure she'd been faking. "He's violating HOA regulations and destroying community property." The officers exchanged looks that spoke volumes. Sergeant Rodriguez professionally reviewed my documentation. Survey, permits, property deed, the works. Everything checked out perfectly, because I'd learned long ago that preparation beats performance every single time. "Ma'am," Rodriguez addressed Cordelia with barely concealed irritation, "this gentleman has every legal right to build on his own property. There's no violation here, and frankly, you're the one trespassing right now." Cordelia's retreat was spectacular, a full tactical withdrawal disguised as righteous indignation. "Well, the HOA still needs to approve aesthetics and materials," she huffed, clicking back to her Lexus like a broken robot. As the squad cars pulled away, Marcus wandered over with a grin that could power the neighborhood. Judge, she had absolutely no idea who she was messing with. That's when the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about fence regulations or community standards. This was about intimidation, control, and probably money. Serious money. Cordelia had just shown me her entire playbook: harassment, false authorities, public humiliation. Too bad for her, I'd been studying bullies a lot longer than she'd been pretending to have power. The sweet smell of sawdust filled the air as I returned to work, but my mind was already racing ahead. If she was this brazen about fake violations, what was she hiding in those financial records she kept dodging? Time to find out exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. That fence incident lit a fire under me that burned hotter than Texas asphalt in July. The next morning, I submitted a formal written request for 3 years of HOA board meeting minutes, documents that, by state law, every homeowner has the right to review. Cordelia's response came faster than a pizza delivery: storage issues and digitization problems. Funny how a woman who could organize a police response in 12 minutes suddenly couldn't locate basic paperwork. I knew from handling municipal contract disputes that financial irregularities always leave paper trails. So I started digging through the publicly available budget numbers posted in that shabby community center. The math made my calculator weep. $388,000 in annual dues collected from 147 households. But where was it all going? The landscaping contract jumped out like a neon sign in a morgue. $89,000 to Pinnacle Property Services, LLC. Pool maintenance? Another $47,000 to the same company. Community center utilities, for a building used maybe 20 hours per month, somehow cost $31,000 annually. Either we were hosting secret NASA launches, or somebody was getting very creative with decimal points. My years investigating municipal corruption had taught me that shell companies are like cockroaches. Where you find one, there's always a nest nearby. A quick business license search through my courthouse connections revealed the smoking gun. Pinnacle Property Services was registered to Derek Blackthorne, as in Cordelia's brother-in-law Derek. The smell of coffee grew cold in my cup as I sat in my home office at midnight, connecting dots that formed a picture uglier than Cordelia's personality. No competitive bidding records, no service quality assessments, just a steady stream of taxpayer money flowing into family pockets like water through a broken dam. That's when Cordelia launched her counterattack. Monday morning brought the first violation notice: unapproved landscaping modifications for planting tomatoes in my backyard. Tuesday delivered excessive outdoor storage because I had a garden hose on a reel. Wednesday's special was architectural non-compliance for using a different doormat than my neighbors. Thursday's masterpiece accused me of parking violations for keeping my pickup truck in my own driveway. 4 violation notices in 1 week. Total fines, $800, escalating daily like compound interest on steroids. But Cordelia wasn't done flexing her imaginary muscles. Anonymous complaints started flooding the city building department about my perfectly legal fence. False noise complaints hit the police department claiming I was running power tools past 6 p.m. when I was actually inside watching Netflix. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with passive-aggressive posts about difficult residents who don't respect community standards. Here's what 20 years of dealing with courtroom bullies had taught me. Document everything, stay calm, and let your enemies hang themselves with their own rope. While Cordelia was busy playing puppet master, I was building a case file that would make federal prosecutors salivate. Time-stamped photos of identical landscaping throughout the neighborhood, no violations issued, screenshots of social media harassment, all traceable to accounts connected to board members. Recordings of increasingly unhinged voicemails from Cordelia, including one where she threatened to make my life a living hell until I learned some respect. The smooth screen of my tablet grew warm under my fingers as I swiped through evidence photos each night, building a digital fortress of documentation. That's when community support started emerging like flowers after a wildfire. Marcus shared his own violation horror stories over beers on his back patio, $100 in fines for solar panels that had every permit imaginable. Mrs. Chen brought homemade cookies and whispered about other neighbors too scared to speak up. A young couple from number 134 approached me at the mailboxes with haunted expressions. We're thinking of selling because the harassment never stops. The pattern was clearer than crystal. Cordelia systematically targeted newer residents, professionals, anyone who might question her authority or threaten her little empire. Then came the emergency board meeting. Cordelia called a special Thursday night session to discuss resident compliance issues. Code for, how do we shut up the judge? Only 3 of the 5 board members showed up at the community center, where the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps overhead. I arrived with a folder thick enough to stop bullets, a legal pad, and a recording device. Perfectly legal in our state, something I'd verified during my prosecutor days. Cordelia's face went pale when she saw me walk in, but the other board members, Eleanor Vance, a retired teacher, and Bob Morrison, an insurance agent, seemed genuinely unaware of the harassment campaign. Agenda Item 4, Cordelia announced with fake authority, property violations and enforcement procedures. That's when I played my hand. I stood up, opened my folder, and began presenting evidence of selective enforcement like I was arguing before the Supreme Court. Photos of identical violations throughout the neighborhood. Documentation of harassment patterns. Questions about the curious lack of competitive bidding for service contracts. Where exactly, I asked, my voice carrying the authority of 2 decades on the bench, are the records showing how Pinnacle Property Services was selected? And why does this company receive 65% of our annual budget without any oversight? Eleanor and Bob exchanged looks that could have powered small appliances. The sound of folding chairs scraping linoleum filled the uncomfortable silence as Cordelia scrambled for answers that didn't exist. But here's where she made her biggest mistake yet. Instead of damage control, she went nuclear. Judge Webb is intimidating board members with his position, she declared, her voice rising to dog whistle frequency. I call for a vote to restrict his meeting attendance based on conflict of interest. Bob Morrison's insurance training kicked in. He smelled liability from 3 counties away. Motion dies for lack of a second, he announced firmly. The meeting ended with the sound of papers rustling and chairs scraping, but the real fireworks were just beginning. Because now I knew exactly how scared Cordelia was, and scared people make desperate mistakes. Time to see just how desperate she'd get. The morning after that disastrous board meeting, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from finally seeing your enemy's hand. Cordelia wasn't just corrupt, she was panicking. And panicked criminals make the kinds of mistakes that fill federal prosecutors' dreams. I spent the next week diving deep into state HOA oversight laws, digging through statute books that most people use as doorstops. What I found was a prosecutor's toolkit sharper than a surgeon's scalpel, powerful enforcement mechanisms, criminal penalties for embezzlement, and personal liability for board members who breach their fiduciary duties. My old colleague AD Patricia Valdez had built her reputation on white-collar crime. Time to give her an early Christmas present. The real breakthrough came when I requested HOA insurance records through my attorney contacts. Hidden in the maze of paperwork was pure gold, $23,000 in claims for landscaping damage that never actually occurred. The maintenance logs were fabricated, signatures forged, and the money had flowed straight into Pinnacle Property Services accounts like water finding its level. The gentle hum of my printer working overtime filled my home office as I copied evidence that would make Cordelia's world collapse faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. That's when she decided to go full nuclear. Thursday night, 10 p.m., maximum intimidation timing, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door with papers that made my blood pressure spike. Cordelia had filed for a restraining order, claiming I was stalking board members and using my judicial position to intimidate innocent volunteers. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. A woman who'd been harassing me for months was now claiming to be the victim. But here's what really caught my attention. She'd hired expensive legal representation. The kind of high-end attorney who charges more per hour than most people make in a week. Where was an HOA president getting that kind of money? The hearing was scheduled in Riverside County to avoid my jurisdiction. Clever move, but not clever enough. Judge Patricia Henley was presiding, and I'd known Patty since law school when she'd helped me pass constitutional law with late-night study sessions fueled by terrible coffee and pure determination. Walking into that courtroom felt like coming home, except I was on the wrong side of the bench. The cold metal of the defendant's chair reminded me how different things looked from this angle, but 20 years of judicial experience had taught me that truth has a way of surfacing like oil on water. Cordelia's attorney, a sharp-dressed shark named Bradley Kensington, painted me as a rogue judge abusing his position to terrorize a volunteer community leader. He had charts, timelines, and enough dramatic flair to audition for Broadway. Too bad he didn't have facts. When my turn came, I methodically presented the harassment timeline, financial evidence, and documentation with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Each exhibit was labeled, cross-referenced, and backed up with sworn affidavits from neighbors who'd finally found the courage to speak truth to power. Judge Henley recognized a frivolous filing when she saw one, the kind of legal bullying that clogs up courts and wastes taxpayer money. She not only denied the restraining order but sanctioned Kensington for filing without merit, ordering Cordelia to pay my legal costs. The sound of that gavel falling was sweeter than church bells on Sunday morning. But victory in court was just the opening act. Back in Maplewood, community momentum was building like a thunderstorm on the horizon. Marcus had organized an informal neighborhood meeting at his house, where lawn chairs unfolded on his patio like battle formations. 12 residents showed up, more than had attended an HOA meeting in years. Mrs. Chen shared 5 years of violation notices totaling $3,400 in fines for imaginary infractions. The new family at number 89 showed photos of demanded landscaping changes that would have bankrupted a small nation. Retired veteran Earl revealed threats over his American flag display. Apparently, patriotism violated Cordelia's aesthetic standards. Everyone agreed. Cordelia had to go. That's when my master plan crystallized like ice forming on glass. I'd learned from prosecuting municipal corruption that you need 3 things to take down entrenched power: criminal charges, civil remedies, and public pressure. Attack from all angles simultaneously, and even the most arrogant criminals crumble. The criminal investigation would freeze HOA accounts pending audit. The civil lawsuit would recover stolen funds and damages. The recall election would give residents democratic control. It was beautiful in its simplicity, death by 1,000 legal cuts. But Cordelia's allies were finally showing themselves. Vice President Sandra Muller, who turned out to be Cordelia's real estate business partner, started damage control mode. Treasurer Frank Delacroix, Sandra's husband, suddenly claimed all the financial irregularities were just bookkeeping errors. The board secretary position had been mysteriously vacant for 8 months, leaving no paper trail of dissent. Only Bob Morrison appeared genuinely shocked by the corruption revelations, which told me everything I needed to know about the depth of this conspiracy. My garage became an investigation center that would make FBI agents jealous. Timelines taped to walls, photo arrays organized by violation type, financial spreadsheets cross-referencing every suspicious payment. The sound of staplers punching through thick document stacks became my evening soundtrack as the case file grew thicker than a phone book. That's when Cordelia made her final desperate play. Anonymous letters to the Judicial Review Board claiming I was abusing my position for personal vendettas. False complaints to the state bar about conflicts of interest. Even vandalism of my fence, spray paint, and loosened boards that my security cameras caught Sandra Muller's teenage son red-handed. She was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. But desperation has a smell. and it was getting stronger every day. The trap was set, baited, and ready to spring. County Prosecutor Patricia was salivating over the evidence package. State regulatory agencies were preparing audits. Recall petitions were being printed. Everything was converging toward the upcoming annual HOA meeting where Cordelia's reign of terror would finally meet its match: democracy, justice, and one very determined judge who'd had enough of petty tyrants. The only question left was whether she'd go down fighting or just go down. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, when insomnia and righteous anger drove me back to the municipal archives. I'd been combing through the original HOA charter documents from 1987, looking for any leverage I might have missed. The musty smell of decades-old paper filled my nostrils as I turned yellowed pages under the harsh fluorescent lights of the county records office. That's when I found it, buried in Section 14. 3 of the original incorporation documents, written in the kind of legal language that makes normal people's eyes glaze over. Any board member convicted of fraud, embezzlement, or breach of fiduciary duty shall result in automatic dissolution of the entire board, with new elections required within 60 days under county oversight. My hands actually trembled as I read those words again. And again. The original developers had built in a nuclear option. One criminal conviction would trigger complete HOA restructure. It was like finding a hidden kill switch in the Death Star's plans. The beautiful part? Cordelia had no idea this clause existed. None of the current board members did. They'd been operating under amended bylaws that had conveniently omitted this particular bombshell over the years. I photographed every page with the reverence of an archaeologist documenting King Tut's tomb. This wasn't just evidence. This was the key to liberating an entire community. But the financial bombshell was even bigger. My accountant friend Janet had spent the weekend reviewing my evidence with the thoroughness of an IRS audit. Her findings made my fence violations look like jaywalking tickets. $127,000 in total embezzlement over 4 years, with money trails leading directly to Cordelia's personal accounts and property investments. The pattern showed criminal evolution, started with small overcharges, grew bolder with fake invoices, and eventually graduated to wholesale theft. Janet's analysis revealed something that made my prosecutor instincts sing. The embezzlement had accelerated dramatically over the past 18 months. Desperation, divorce proceedings, and a failing real estate market had turned Cordelia from a petty thief into a full-blown criminal enterprise. Sitting in my leather judicial chair that night, surrounded by evidence that could topple a government, I realized I held the nuclear option. One conviction would trigger complete dissolution. HOA insurance would cover resident reimbursements. Fraud victims would be protected. New elections would allow a complete community reset with proper oversight mechanisms. The smooth leather creaked under my weight as I leaned back, planning the endgame with the precision of a chess grandmaster. Every move from here would be calculated, documented, and devastating. What made this even sweeter was the intelligence network that had emerged like a resistance movement. Marcus's electrician contacts were revealing systematic overcharging for basic maintenance. Mrs. Chen's gardener friend had blown the whistle on landscaping invoice padding, work never performed but always billed. The pool company maintenance supervisor was ready to testify about fraudulent service claims that would make Tony Soprano blush. My phone buzzed constantly with new evidence tips, each message another nail in Cordelia's legal coffin. But the perfect storm was bigger than just my investigation. County Prosecutor Patricia Valdez was building her political career on cleaning up municipal corruption. A high-profile HOA case would be campaign gold. The state attorney general had just launched a statewide HOA fraud initiative after similar scandals in Dallas and Austin. Local news was investigating HOA corruption following reader complaints. Even better, it was election season, and every politician wanted to appear tough on the kind of petty corruption that drives voters crazy. The vulnerability I'd sensed in Cordelia was now crystal clear. Her recent divorce had left her financially stressed, her real estate business was drowning in a down market, and the HOA embezzlement had become her lifeline, funding her lifestyle, property investments, and probably that expensive attorney who'd just lost spectacularly in court. The desperation was getting stronger. I could smell it like smoke from a house fire. Increased perfume couldn't mask the chain smoking at board meetings, the trembling hands when she thought no one was looking, the way her voice cracked when delivering threats that used to sound authoritative. Everything was aligned like planets during a rare eclipse. criminal evidence, civil remedies, regulatory oversight, media attention, and political pressure. Cordelia had built her little empire on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in fast. The original charter's dissolution clause was my ace in the hole, but I wouldn't need to play it yet. Sometimes the threat of total destruction is more powerful than the destruction itself. Time to see how she'd react when she realized her world was crumbling faster than a stale cookie. The morning after discovering that nuclear option in the charter, my dining room looked like a CIA operation planning the overthrow of a small country. Wall maps of the neighborhood showed violation patterns marked in different colored pushpins: red for harassment, blue for financial irregularities, yellow for selective enforcement. Financial flowcharts covered every surface, tracking money like bloodhounds following a scent trail. The sound of sticky notes being rearranged and markers squeaking across whiteboards became my morning symphony as I orchestrated the most satisfying takedown of my legal career. First, I assembled my team, not the Avengers, but close enough for neighborhood justice. Marcus brought electrical expertise and street credibility that money couldn't buy. Mrs. Chen provided historical knowledge and the moral authority that comes from surviving 87 years of life's battles. Patricia Valdez offered prosecutorial power and media connections that could turn local corruption into statewide headlines. Earl the veteran contributed organizational skills sharp enough to run a military campaign. Even Bob Morrison, the one honest board member, became our inside source. My strategy was beautifully simple. Attack from 3 directions simultaneously, like a perfectly coordinated military operation. Criminal prosecution would freeze assets and establish legal precedent. Civil remedies would recover stolen funds and compensate victims. Administrative action would trigger state oversight and license revocations. Death by 1,000 legal cuts, each one precisely placed for maximum damage. The evidence package grew thicker than a small-town phone book. 347 pages of financial records, contracts, and invoices that painted a picture uglier than abstract art. 89 photos documenting selective enforcement that would make civil rights lawyers weep with joy. 23 audio recordings of harassment incidents, including Cordelia's threat to destroy anyone who challenges community standards. A timeline showing escalation patterns over 4 years that read like a criminal psychology textbook. The heavy cardboard of evidence boxes and metal rings of binders became familiar textures under my fingers as I organized enough documentation to convict a small army of white-collar criminals. Media strategy came next, because public pressure makes politicians move faster than caffeine makes hummingbirds fly. Channel 7 investigative reporter Jennifer Kim was already sniffing around HOA corruption stories. Apparently, reader complaints had been flooding in like spring rain. The local newspaper editor was hungry for community interest pieces that actually mattered to real people. Social media campaigns were planned around the recall election, with residents finally ready to tell their stories without fear of retaliation. The sound of keyboards clicking filled neighborhood living rooms as residents typed Facebook testimonials that would make Cordelia's PR problems look like a Category 5 hurricane. But the financial forensics was where things got truly beautiful. My CPA friend Janet had traced fund diversions through a shell company network more complex than a NASA launch sequence. Bank records showed personal expenditures from HOA accounts, spa treatments, jewelry purchases, and restaurant bills that would feed a small village. Property records revealed Cordelia's unexplained real estate investments, funded entirely by money that should have been fixing our community. From my prosecutor days, I'd learned that financial records don't lie even when people do. They're like digital fingerprints at a crime scene, impossible to completely erase no matter how hard criminals try. The recall election mechanics were surprisingly straightforward once you cut through the bureaucratic nonsense. We needed 74 signatures from 147 households, 25% to trigger the recall, 30 days for petition circulation, then elections within 45 days of a successful petition. Sample ballots were designed showing reform candidates who actually gave a damn about the community instead of their bank accounts. Community education became our secret weapon. Information packets explained HOA financial basics in language that wouldn't require law degrees to understand. Know Your Rights workshops at the community center taught residents how to request financial records, attend board meetings effectively, and document harassment like prosecutors building cases. Meanwhile, Bob Morrison was feeding us inside information that made Tom Clancy novels look boring. Cordelia was panicking over missing treasurer records that could expose years of additional fraud. Sandra Muller was attempting to alter historical documents like some kind of suburban Nixon. Frank Delacroix had consulted a bankruptcy attorney, apparently preparing for the financial apocalypse heading his way. Emergency board meetings were being called without resident notification, a violation of state sunshine laws that would add more charges to the growing pile. The smell of burning paper drifted from behind the community center one night as compromised materials were destroyed, but digital records are harder to kill than movie villains. Everything was backed up, encrypted, and stored in multiple locations like a distributed resistance network. Technology became our force multiplier. A professional website, Reform Maplewood HOA, went live with documentation that would make investigative journalists drool. Online petitions gathered electronic signatures faster than a viral cat video. Databases tracked every violation pattern, creating statistical evidence of systematic discrimination. Notification sounds from phones and tablets became the soundtrack of revolution as community support grew from dozens to hundreds of supporters across the county. But the legal trap was my masterpiece. Ethics complaints were filed against Cordelia's real estate license for conflicts of interest. Insurance fraud was reported to state regulatory agencies that took white-collar crime personally. Tax evasion evidence was forwarded to the IRS because nobody escapes the tax man, not even HOA tyrants. Every escape route was blocked, every ally neutralized, every financial resource frozen or monitored. The timeline was accelerating beyond my wildest expectations. Criminal investigations moved faster when prosecutors smelled political opportunity. Media attention intensified as the story spread through social networks like wildfire. Public pressure mounted as residents realized they weren't alone in their frustration. Cordelia's desperate attempt to move up the annual HOA meeting was her final mistake, rushing toward a confrontation she couldn't win, with an audience she couldn't control and evidence she couldn't suppress. The sound of staplers, copiers, and phones ringing filled my makeshift campaign office as final preparations fell into place. Every document was copied, every witness was prepared, every legal strategy was polished to courtroom perfection. Time to watch a petty tyrant learn what real accountability looks like. Desperation has a distinct smell, part fear, part flop sweat, part expensive perfume trying to mask the stench of panic. And Cordelia was absolutely reeking of it. The morning after our war room planning session, she called an emergency board meeting to remove me as a resident for conflict of interest. The logic was breathtaking in its stupidity. A homeowner couldn't investigate his own HOA because he lived there. It was like saying witnesses can't testify because they saw the crime. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps as she banged her gavel in an almost empty room. Only Sandra Muller supported the motion. Even Frank Delacroix was smart enough to smell the liability. The meeting failed for lack of quorum. But watching Cordelia's face turn the color of overripe tomatoes was worth the wasted evening. That's when the Dirty Tricks campaign began in earnest. Anonymous flyers appeared on driveways overnight like toxic snow, claiming I was abusing judicial power to terrorize innocent volunteers. The cheap printer ink smudged under morning dew, leaving black fingerprints on every mailbox in the neighborhood. Fake social media accounts sprouted like weeds, attacking reform candidates with the kind of manufactured outrage that makes internet trolls proud. Robocalls targeted elderly residents with lies smoother than snake oil. Judge Webb is using his position to eliminate HOA protections for your property values. Mrs. Chen got 3 calls in one day before she unplugged her phone and marched over to my house with fire in her eyes and cookies in her hands. But Cordelia wasn't satisfied with character assassination. She wanted actual sabotage. Reform campaign signs vanished overnight, replaced by spray-painted messages that would make sailors blush. My mailbox was stuffed with threatening letters written in block print that screamed angry teenager with parental issues. Marcus found his work truck with 4 slashed tires in his driveway, which earned him a police report and a very expensive lesson in why security cameras are worth every penny. Speaking of cameras, mine caught Sandra Muller's 16-year-old son with a spray can at 2:47 a.m., tagging my fence with creativity that would impress graffiti artists, but not juvenile court judges. The kid looked exactly like his mother. Same entitled expression, same belief that rules applied to other people. Meanwhile, financial records were disappearing faster than evidence at a mob trial. The HOA office suffered a convenient burglary where only financial files were stolen. Apparently, thieves these days are very selective about paperwork. Computer hard drives mysteriously crashed with the timing of a Swiss watch. Bank statements got lost in transition to the new accounting firm that nobody had authorized. The smell of industrial shredding filled the night air behind the community center, working overtime like Santa's elves, but destroying instead of creating. But 20 years of prosecuting white-collar criminals had taught me that digital records are like cockroaches, nearly impossible to completely eliminate. My subpoenas through Patricia's office went directly to banks, bypassing HOA stonewalling entirely. Computer forensics experts recovered deleted financial data from backup servers that criminals always forget exist. Insurance companies provided duplicate records going back years because insurance companies keep everything except their customers' money. Every document they destroyed had been copied. Every file they deleted had been recovered. Every lie they told was recorded and documented. The real bombshell came when Derek Blackthorne, Cordelia's brother-in-law and Pinnacle Property Services owner, contacted me through Marcus with the desperation of a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. We met at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, sliding into a back booth like characters in a spy novel, while the smell of bacon grease and desperation filled the air. Derek looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, his eyes darting around the empty restaurant like a hunted animal. "She's lost her mind," he whispered, stirring coffee with shaking hands. The kickbacks were supposed to be small, temporary, just until her real estate business recovered. Now she's threatening my family if I don't keep inflating invoices. He handed me a manila envelope thick enough to stop bullets, containing original invoices that showed the real scope of the fraud. Work never performed, materials never delivered, services billed at 3 times market rates. The evidence was so damning it practically glowed in the fluorescent diner lighting. "She's planning something big for the annual meeting," Derek warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sandra's been making calls to city council members claiming you're using your position illegally. They're trying to get you removed from the bench before the meeting." But family pressure was tearing Cordelia's conspiracy apart like tissue paper in a hurricane. Derek wasn't the only one cracking under the strain. Her husband had discovered the embezzlement and filed for separation, taking their teenage daughter to his mother's house. The daughter was mortified by social media exposure that had turned her into a pariah at school. Even her real estate clients were fleeing faster than tourists from a Category 5 hurricane. The sound of raised voices from Cordelia's house became neighborhood entertainment as her world collapsed in real time. Neighbors gathered at fence lines like spectators at a demolition derby, watching 20 years of marriage and business partnerships explode in spectacular fashion. Media attention was accelerating beyond our wildest dreams. Channel 7's investigation had expanded into a 5-part series on HOA corruption across the state. The newspaper ran daily exposés that made Watergate look like a parking ticket scandal. Social media campaigns reached 15,000 local residents and growing, with hashtag Maplewood corruption trending like a viral dance craze. The sound of news van generators humming outside the community center became our neighborhood's new soundtrack, drowning out the usual sounds of suburban tranquility. Law enforcement was escalating faster than a police chase. FBI financial crimes units had joined the investigation, bringing federal resources that made local prosecutors look like mall security guards. Asset forfeiture warrants froze Cordelia's accounts with the efficiency of liquid nitrogen. Real estate licenses were suspended pending investigation, cutting off her last legitimate income source. The texture of cold metal handcuffs was becoming very real as federal agents prepared arrest warrants with the thoroughness of Swiss watchmakers. Community support reached critical mass as 89 residents signed recall petitions, well above the required threshold. Reform candidates filed for board positions with platforms focused on transparency, accountability, and basic human decency. The Take Back Our Community rally was planned for the weekend before the annual meeting, complete with grilled burgers and the kind of patriotic fervor that makes politicians nervous. The smell of charcoal and righteousness would soon fill the air as democracy prepared to reassert itself. But Cordelia had one final desperate gambit, attempting to dissolve the entire HOA to avoid prosecution. Emergency legal filings claimed residents could manage without board oversight, like arguing that banks don't need security because customers are basically honest. Judge Patricia Henley denied the motion so fast it left skid marks on the court docket, sanctioning Cordelia's attorney for filing frivolous paperwork. The evidence avalanche was reaching biblical proportions. Additional contractors came forward with kickback stories that would make organized crime jealous. Insurance fraud investigators found patterns of fake claims going back 6 years. Tax records showed unreported income that would make the IRS audit department positively giddy. The sound of my printer working overtime became the soundtrack of justice as evidence copies multiplied like rabbits in springtime. Everything was converging toward the annual meeting where Cordelia's reign of terror would finally meet its match: democracy, transparency, and one very determined community that had finally found its voice. The only question left was whether she'd surrender gracefully or go down swinging like a cornered animal. My money was on cornered animal. The federal grand jury indictment came down like a hammer of justice on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Maplewood's history into before and after. 14 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy against Cordelia Blackthorne. State charges followed like dominoes falling: insurance fraud, tax evasion, and breach of fiduciary duty. Her real estate license was revoked so fast it left digital skid marks on the state database. My phone buzzed constantly with news alerts that read like Christmas morning for justice enthusiasts. Cordelia's panic reached legendary proportions. She tried to flee jurisdiction with the grace of a wounded rhinoceros, getting caught at the airport with $47,000 in cash and a one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands. When that failed, she attempted to liquidate hidden assets that had already been frozen tighter than a politician's smile during election season. Her final gambit was begging residents for understanding and forgiveness in a rambling Facebook post that went viral for all the wrong reasons. The texture of smeared mascara and trembling hands became her new reality as the walls closed in faster than a trash compactor in a space opera. The media circus intensified beyond our wildest expectations. National news picked up the story as the perfect example of HOA corruption run amok. Suburban tyranny meets federal justice. I found myself on courthouse steps being interviewed as the judge who exposed neighborhood fraud, trying to maintain judicial dignity while internally celebrating like a kid at Christmas. Documentary crews requested access for investigative series about municipal corruption. The sound of camera shutters clicking became the soundtrack of accountability as reporters descended on our quiet neighborhood like well-dressed locusts with press credentials. But the real satisfaction came from community healing that started the moment Cordelia's arrest became public knowledge. The interim board appointed by county oversight immediately suspended all fraudulent fines. Residents received reimbursement checks from insurance companies with the efficiency of tax refunds in an election year. The smell of fresh paint filled the air as vandalized properties were repaired and community pride was restored. Sandra Muller and Frank Delacroix collapsed faster than a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Sandra pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges, her real estate empire crumbling like ancient architecture. Frank cooperated with investigators for reduced sentences, providing testimony that would make prosecutors weep with joy. The sound of for sale signs being planted in their front yards was sweeter than wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Derek Blackthorne's full cooperation became the gift that kept on giving. His complete financial records revealed kickback schemes more elaborate than Swiss watches. His testimony about inflated contracts and fraudulent billing would anchor the prosecution's case like concrete foundations. His cooperation deal proved that honesty really can be the best policy, especially when facing federal prison time. The reformed HOA board emerged like democracy rising from the ashes of corruption. I accepted the interim presidency with the same sense of duty that had guided my judicial career. Marcus became treasurer, bringing electrical contractor financial skills and working-class honesty to budget oversight. Mrs. Chen transformed into community liaison, her 87 years of wisdom finally getting the respect it deserved. Earl handled architectural review with veteran attention to detail that made military inspections look casual. Bob Morrison continued as secretary, now freed to actually serve the community instead of covering up crimes. New policies were implemented with the thoroughness of constitutional amendments. All contracts required competitive bidding with public oversight. Financial records were published monthly online with transparency that would make government agencies jealous. Violation appeals processes were established that actually protected residents' rights. Community input became mandatory for major expenditures because democracy works best when people participate. The State Judicial Ethics Review Board examined my actions with the intensity of forensic accountants auditing the mob. Their conclusion was unanimous. All actions fell within homeowner rights and legal professional conduct. They commended my use of legal expertise for community benefit, noting that fighting corruption was exactly what judges should do in their private lives. The sound of that gavel closing the ethics hearing was pure exoneration music. The ripple effect spread like waves from a boulder dropped in still water. Other HOAs across 3 counties requested my advice on reform initiatives. State legislature scheduled hearings on new oversight laws inspired by the Maplewood model. Prosecutor Patricia used the case as a launching pad for her Attorney General campaign, promising to clean up municipal corruption statewide. The texture of business cards from communities seeking help grew thick in my wallet as the movement spread beyond our neighborhood borders. But Cordelia's final desperate move proved that cornered animals really are the most dangerous. From her jail cell, she attempted to negotiate a plea deal by claiming the entire investigation was a personal vendetta, orchestrated by a rogue judge with a grudge. Her attorney painted me as some kind of suburban Batman, using judicial powers for vigilante justice. Federal prosecutor Patricia Valdez rejected the deal faster than a bad restaurant review, proceeding to trial with evidence so overwhelming it would make defense attorneys consider career changes. The sound of that jail cell door clanging shut became the official soundtrack of justice served. Preparation for the annual HOA meeting intensified like the final scene of a courtroom drama. The event was transformed from a routine bureaucratic gathering into a public celebration of democracy triumphant. Media were granted access for transparency that would make government meetings jealous. All 147 households were personally invited to participate in real democracy, instead of the theatrical productions Cordelia had staged for years. The smell of coffee brewing in the community center mixed with the anticipation of residents who were finally free to speak truth without fear of retaliation. Security measures were implemented not to keep people out, but to ensure everyone could get in safely. The venue was expanded to accommodate record attendance expected for what local news was calling the most important HOA meeting in county history. But the most beautiful part was watching neighbors emerge from years of intimidation like flowers blooming after a long winter. Violation victims shared their stories without fear. Financial fraud survivors compared notes with the enthusiasm of support group members. Reform candidates stepped forward with platforms based on transparency and accountability instead of personal enrichment. The texture of petition signatures felt like democracy in action as residents reclaimed their community from the ashes of corruption. Everything was converging toward one moment when justice, democracy, and community spirit would finally triumph over petty tyranny and financial fraud. The annual meeting would be more than administrative theater. It would be a celebration of what happens when good people refuse to stay silent and one determined judge decides that enough is enough. The only question left was whether the community center could hold all the people who wanted to witness justice being served with a side of accountability. The big day arrived with the kind of electric anticipation usually reserved for Super Bowl Sundays or presidential elections. The annual HOA meeting had been transformed from a dreaded bureaucratic obligation into the hottest ticket in town, democracy's comeback tour with standing room only. Channel 7 news crews arrived at dawn, their generators humming like mechanical honeybees as they set up cameras with the precision of a NASA launch. Reporter Jennifer Kim had promoted this as the finale to her 5-part HOA corruption exposé, promising viewers justice served live and unfiltered. By 6 p.m., the community center parking lot looked like a tailgate party for civic engagement. 134 of our 147 households were represented, the highest attendance in Maplewood's 37-year history. Folding chairs arranged in military precision filled every available space, with overflow seating spilling onto the patio where outdoor speakers carried the proceedings to residents who couldn't squeeze inside. The sound of microphone feedback testing mixed with excited conversations as neighbors who'd been isolated by fear finally gathered in unified purpose. I took the podium at exactly 7 p.m., the smooth microphone familiar in my hands after 20 years of delivering judicial rulings. But this felt different, warmer, more personal, like addressing family instead of defendants. Friends and neighbors, I began, my voice carrying the authority of both office and experience. 6 months ago, most of us felt helpless against a system designed to intimidate and exploit. Tonight, we celebrate what happens when a community finds its voice and demands accountability. Warm applause filled the room like sunrise breaking over mountains, genuine appreciation from people who'd rediscovered the power of democracy. Marcus stepped forward with financial recovery reports that made Excel spreadsheets sexy. His electrician's precision delivered numbers that hit like heavyweight punches, $89,000 in fraudulent charges reversed and refunded to residents. $127,000 in total fraud recovered through asset forfeiture that would fund community improvements for years. Insurance companies covering all resident reimbursements because fraud victims deserve protection, not punishment. The sound of surprised gasps and happy murmurs rippled through the crowd as residents realized they were holding actual settlement checks, real money returned from the criminals who'd stolen it. But the evening's dramatic centerpiece came via live courthouse update from downtown, where Cordelia's fate was being decided by 12 jurors who'd heard enough evidence to convict a small army. Reporter Kim's phone buzzed at 7:47 p.m. with news that made the entire room hold its breath. Guilty on 12 of 14 counts. The sentencing was swift and satisfying: 4 years federal prison, $180,000 in restitution, and permanent revocation of her real estate license. Sandra Muller received 18 months probation and 500 hours of community service, fitting punishment for someone who'd forgotten what community actually meant. When Kim turned her camera toward me for the live interview that would make local news history, I felt the weight of 20 years on the bench distilled into one perfect moment. "Judge Webb," she asked, her voice carrying the gravity of investigative journalism at its finest, "what would you tell other communities facing HOA corruption?" I looked directly into that camera lens, knowing my words would reach thousands of residents trapped in their own HOA nightmares. Document everything, know your rights, never let bullies win through intimidation. And remember, democracy works when good people refuse to stay silent. The camera panned across cheering residents, capturing community unity that would make Norman Rockwell weep with patriotic pride. That's when I dropped the surprise that would cement this evening in neighborhood legend. The seized assets from Cordelia's criminal enterprise have created a community improvement fund totaling $45,000. Tonight, we vote on how to spend money stolen from us but returned by justice. The smell of celebration cake being wheeled in mixed with the sweet aroma of victory as residents realized their suffering had been transformed into community treasure. The vote was unanimous: playground renovation for families, pool repairs for everyone, and a memorial garden honoring the courage of residents who'd finally stood up to tyranny. Children's laughter echoed from outside where they were already playing, their voices the soundtrack of a neighborhood reborn. Recognition ceremonies followed like Academy Awards for civic heroes. Marcus received the Community Leadership Award for organizing resistance when resistance seemed impossible. Mrs. Chen was honored for community service that proved wisdom and courage have no expiration date. Earl's flag display was officially approved with a ceremony that made grown veterans weep with pride. The sound of children playing in the background provided the perfect soundtrack to normal neighborhood life, finally restored. The new board installation felt like a constitutional convention in miniature. My election as permanent president was unanimous, not because I sought power, but because the community trusted judicial experience over personal ambition. The reformed board took an oath of transparency that would be carved in stone if we could afford it. Our first motion passed without dissent. All meetings would be recorded and published online because sunshine really is the best disinfectant for governmental corruption. National attention followed like moths to flames of justice. Good Morning America featured our story as proof that individual courage could create systemic change. Social media exploded with #Maplewood model hashtags as communities nationwide shared their own HOA horror stories and reform strategies. The sound of phones buzzing with viral notifications became the soundtrack of influence spreading beyond our neighborhood borders. Law enforcement presence provided the evening's final validation. Sheriff's deputies attended as invited guests, with Sergeant Rodriguez commending community cooperation that made their jobs easier. FBI financial crimes agents spoke about fraud prevention with the enthusiasm of teachers who'd finally found engaged students. The texture of firm handshakes and gleaming badges under community center lights felt like democracy and justice working in perfect harmony. But the emotional climax belonged to the residents whose courage had made everything possible. An elderly widow broke down thanking me for saving her home from foreclosure caused by fraudulent fines. The young family from number 134 announced they were staying because our neighborhood is finally safe for honest people. The veterans group presented a flag to replace the one Cordelia had called a violation. Patriotism officially restored to its rightful place. The sound of tissues rustling and emotional voices expressing gratitude filled the room like music from angels who'd finally witnessed justice served with a side of community healing. As the evening wound down and residents filed out with hope restored and democracy renewed, I realized this was what 20 years on the bench had been preparing me for, not just dispensing justice from behind a desk, but helping an entire community reclaim its voice and its future. Sometimes the best rulings happen outside the courtroom. 6 months later, Maplewood Estates had transformed from a cautionary tale into a beacon of hope that attracted visitors like pilgrims seeking proof that justice really can prevail. Property values increased 12%, not because of artificial restrictions, but because people actually wanted to live in a community governed by transparency instead of tyranny. The sound of children's laughter echoed from our renovated playground every evening, their voices mixing with the gentle splash of families enjoying a pool that finally served the community instead of enriching criminals. 0 frivolous violations had been issued since the new board took office, and our appeals process sat unused, a monument to fair governance that made residents feel protected instead of persecuted. Mrs. Chen's expanded community garden bloomed with flowers that filled the evening air with fragrances sweeter than any perfume Cordelia had ever worn. Her ceramic gnome stood proudly among prize-winning tomatoes, silent sentinels proving that personal expression and community standards could coexist beautifully. My woodworking shop had evolved into the neighborhood's unofficial meeting place, where the smooth grain of sanded cedar under my fingers provided therapy for 20 years of courtroom stress. The workshop became a symbol of creativity and productivity, everything Cordelia's regime had tried to suppress in favor of conformity and control. The ripple effect continued spreading like seeds on fertile ground. 23 communities across 4 states had requested consultation on HOA reform, turning our local victory into a regional movement. The Maplewood Act passed through state legislature with bipartisan support, strengthening oversight mechanisms and establishing criminal penalties for board members who betrayed their fiduciary duties. Prosecutor Patricia Valdez won her attorney general race in a landslide, campaigning on a platform of municipal corruption cleanup that resonated with voters tired of petty tyrants wielding imaginary power. Her victory proved that fighting for justice could be both morally right and politically smart. Individual courage really can create systemic change. One person willing to stand up can inspire entire communities to reclaim their voices and their futures. The Community Accountability Scholarship was announced at the local high school graduation ceremony, where the sound of applause for educational opportunity mixed with the sweet scent of possibility. $5,000 annually would support students studying law, public service, or any field dedicated to protecting communities from the kind of corruption we'd overcome. The scholarship honored every resident who'd found courage to speak truth to power, transforming their suffering into hope for future generations. Cordelia served 3 years in federal prison, where reportedly she worked in the law library helping inmates with appeals, perhaps learning what justice actually meant when you couldn't buy your way out of consequences. Her restitution payments continued under court supervision, every dollar a reminder that crime really doesn't pay in the long run. Her house sold to a young family with children who brought bicycle sounds and sidewalk chalk art to a street that had forgotten how to smile. Marcus's electrical business boomed as word spread about honest contractors who charged fair prices and delivered quality work. He employed 2 additional electricians from the neighborhood, proving that integrity could be both profitable and community building. The sound of power tools became the soundtrack of honest work rebuilding trust one job at a time. Mrs. Chen organized democracy and action workshops that attracted residents from across the county, her 87 years of wisdom finally receiving the platform it deserved. The smell of jasmine tea filled evening sessions where she taught civic participation with the passion of a civics teacher who actually cared about her students' futures. Earl's American flag flew proudly without fear of violation notices, while his memorial garden planning brought veterans together for healing that went deeper than landscaping. The soft texture of flag fabric fluttering in the breeze became a symbol of freedom that actually meant something in our community. But the most satisfying victory was watching our neighborhood return to what it should have been all along, a place where families could build lives without fear, where diversity was celebrated instead of punished, where community meant cooperation instead of competition. My phone rang one Tuesday morning with a familiar sound that made me smile. Another community in distress, this time from a mountain town dealing with water rights corruption involving a management company that made Cordelia look like an amateur. Judge Webb, the caller said with desperation I recognized from my own experience 6 months earlier, "We've heard about Maplewood. Can you help us too?" The next adventure was calling, and I realized that fighting corruption had become more than a personal mission. It was a calling that combined my judicial experience with community service in ways that made both more meaningful. But tonight, sitting in my backyard workshop with the scent of cedar shavings and the distant sound of neighbors chatting over fences, I reflected on something that made all the effort worthwhile. Sometimes the system works exactly as designed, when good people refuse to stay silent and stand up for what's right. The community celebration continued in the background as another Tuesday evening painted our neighborhood in golden light, American flag waving gently in the breeze that carried the sounds of children playing and families living freely. That's what victory sounds like in real life, not dramatic.